Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. And today I want to talk about a graphic novel that I read. I am back on that graphic novel grind. This is also a booktube challenge for my friend Lucas over at The Bits of Lit. Although he dropped out of doing this mutual challenge a couple volumes back, which means I am automatically the winner of the booktube challenge, and I am now the owner of the Golden Shawl, although that's beside the point. And today's short story is all about swamp monsters and space. I am referring to the Saga of the Swamp Thing, Volume 6 by Alan Moore, as well as Rick Vetch. He had a large part in some of these volumes, with art by John Totalben, Alfredo Alcala, and many, many others. And this was published in 1987. I talked about Alan Moore on this channel before, especially in the past 5 other volumes in this series. So I don't need to go into any real detail here other than noting that he is a big name in the graphic novel, comic book circles. Very well regarded for a lot of the works that he had written in the 80s and the 90s, and continues to write to this day. So I don't think I need to go into too much detail, other than noting, I'm finally made it through this series. So this video, the analysis section will be an analysis of this specific volume, but also talk a little bit more about, an overall analysis of what Moore was talking about in this series, the ideas he was throwing out there, and my overall enjoyment of it and how much I recommend it to you out there. Spoiler alert, I will end up recommending it, so go seek this out if you haven't done so already. It is a pretty high quality collection, and a really great run. I made it through his entire run of Swamp Thing, and there's more Swamp Thing to go after this, but I don't think I'm really going to look into that too much, although it's worth noting that Grant Morrison did the next run of Swamp Thing afterwards. I don't know if that's highly regarded in any way, but it might be something worth looking into. And so without further ado, let's talk about Volume 6 here. I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So Volume 6 of Swamp Thing focuses on right where the previous volume left off. Swamp Thing is traveling through space, sending his consciousness into the stars, unable to return back to Earth because the government men altered his biochemistry to the point where he can no longer enter the green on Earth, which is unfortunate. And Swamp Thing eventually travels through space and lands on the planet Ran, which is a dying planet that's seen one too many thermonuclear wars. And on that planet, there is a man named Adam Strange, who is a local superhero, and is sort of passing between Earth and Ran because he is in love with the princess of Ran. But they're trying to figure out how to save this planet. And Swamp Thing gets into a fight with Strange, which Adam Strange thinks he wins, but he soon finds out that Swamp Thing can regenerate. And so he asks Swamp Thing to recreate the plant life on Ran, which Swamp Thing is able to do. However, this upsets the Hawk people, who are from the same planet as Hawkman and Hawkgirl, and they're upset because they were promised the technology of Ran if they could solve the problem, but here's Swamp Thing solving the problem on his own. And so they get into a big fight, and they almost manage to kill Swamp Thing to some degree, but Adam Strange interferes and manages to help Swamp Thing defeat the Hawk people, and from there Adam Strange promises that the planet J586 might be able to help Swamp Thing because they have sentient plant life on the planet, and Adam Strange promises to deliver a message to Abby when he heads back to Earth. And then we see back on Earth, Abby is not having a great time. She's still mourning the loss of Swamp Thing, apparently. And we can see that in Hell, Anton, what is his name? Our Anton Arcane, Dr. Arcane, is in hell being tortured by demons, and the demons are sort of torturing Abby as well in order to get at Anton and deliver his punishment for whatever he did on Earth. And so what they do is they regenerate or bring back to life Gregory Arcane, who was Abby's father, who died on a minefield in Eastern Europe when she was a child. Abby finds out about this and tracks him down, is able to, hug him, but a hailstorm happens and he falls apart and dies, and Abby is once again left mourning. Things are not going so well for her. And then Adam Strange shows up a short while later, and while Abby is happy to hear that Swamp Thing is still alive, she's very saddened again to hear that he's not able to make it back to Earth. Meanwhile, Swamp Thing is traveling through space. He encounters a living machine planet that is very curious about his ability to throw his consciousness around. And what the machine does is it traps him in a time loop that prevents him from throwing his consciousness out, and it takes his body apart. And a really horrific bit of writing by Moore and Veitch here. And then it takes his reproductive organs before letting him send his consciousness out, with the assumption that it's going to use those reproductive organs to create a offspring of this machine planet, and who knows what that's going to lead to down the road. Swamp Thing eventually lands on J586, but finds that because the plant life is sentient, any plant life that he absorbs to create a person, to create a body, is sentient and therefore screaming because now it's all being meshed together. Which is terrifying, and again horrific writing there. Luckily, the Green Lantern Metaphil shows up and is able to separate his consciousness from the screaming bodies, and he's able to plant Swamp Thing's consciousness into a dead body of one of his mentors, which Metaphil is happy that he gets to talk with again. Metaphil helps him re-alter his biochemistry so that he's able to land back on Earth, and Swamp Thing heads back, but not before passing by Metron, who is a friend of Darkseid, the scary Justice League villain. And they pass through the final barrier of what is supposedly Apocalypse, which shows the great beyond and the meaning of all life. But while Swamp Thing is there, he sees a constant loop of bodies being burned that will eventually turn into the new Swamp Thing, and he goes mad. But luckily, Metron is able to reconfigure his mind and allow his consciousness to head back to Earth. But Darkseid sees Swamp Thing's memories and all the things that drove him mad, including his love of Abby, and just remarks that that's interesting. And then when Swamp Thing gets to Earth, he kills all of the government men, including one in a way where they're eating a tomato, and then he just forces that a tree to come out of that person, which is again horrific. A lot of body horror and just general terrifying things being written in this volume. And then Abby visits Matt in the hospital, seeing that he's still in a coma and lamenting the loss of him as well as everything else. But then Abby travels with Chester to the swamps, and she re-encounters Swamp Thing, and everything is hunky-dory from there. And while Abby is passed out from another romantic session, which surely won't get Swamp Thing arrested again, Swamp Thing ponders his power and whether he has a choice, or if he has a decision to make about whether he wants to actually help humanity. And if he does help humanity, will that stop humanity from doing further bad things to the planet down the road? And he decides no. So it's ultimately up to humanity to solve their environmental problems. And he and Abby decide at that point that they're going to retire to the swamp and let the rest of the world take care of itself. And ends on a bit of a positive note, with the narrator noting that the swamps and the wilderness are a great and peaceful place to be. And that's about where it ends there. In terms of analysis, there is a fair bit to talk about with Volume 6. I think one of the biggest things to talk about is the horror in this volume. I think I talked about the horror in previous volumes of Swamp Thing sort of being a kind of horrific creature, and how Alan Moore heavily leaning on that, whether it be about incorporating werewolves or underwater vampires, or Swamp Thing sort of being an unseen force hiding in the shadows and willing to strike whenever. I think Alan Moore, in general, throughout this entire series, has leaned heavily into that element of horror. But in addition to that, in this volume, you get a more science fiction aspect of the horror, as Swamp Thing is now in space, and with the help of Rick Veitch, who was a big component according to the introduction of this volume, you get an added element of the horrors that you can find in space, and how it creates absolutely the worst possible time for Swamp Thing. And the ways that you see that are in the story Loving the Alien, where he encounters the machine planet. And in that, Swamp Thing, is captured by this machine planet, forced into a time loop that he cannot escape, and then his body is ripped apart while he is apparently still living, which, would drive anyone to madness, but it doesn't drive Swamp Thing into madness. And so, you got the element of this weird living planet that has nefarious motives, and the act of being ripped apart and kind of raped in a way. I think that's what Alan Moore is going for. Very Alien, Ridley Scott-esque of the writing there. And then you see him going mad in Apocalypse, in the final barrier, where he sees his life on repeat, although things that aren't quite his own life. He sees constant burning, not only his own burning and turning into Swamp Thing, but other people's. And then he sees that combined with his love for Abby. And I think what happens there is Swamp Thing is forced to confront the fact that maybe there have been other Abbys in different incarnations of Swamp Thing. So his love for Abby is not unique to him. But while there has been multiple incarnations of a physical embodiment of the green in Swamp Thing, this is just his version of him. So his life is on a loop, and he's forced to see that over and over and over and over again. And it's not in the norm. Usually people have a life, they live, they die, and that's what Swamp Thing thinks he is. And then you also see in the story All Flesh is Grass, where Swamp Thing jumps to J586, tries to get a foothold in the green there, and quickly discovers that all the plant life is sentient. So he's controlling actual living things that do not want to be controlled. And there's a good quote from this that I would like to read to you. "And great Metaphil clenches his mind, and the horror is manacled by shackles of green underwater light, and children are crushed against an unyielding phosphorescent splintering as the monster struggles against his chains. No, something else, stunning it, perhaps. And the horror staggers, then topples, an avalanche of screaming timber, a log slide of people, and their unidentifiable fragments are scattered over several blocks. No, 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 no." And that's very interesting because Swamp Thing, or the narrator is describing what's happening to Swamp Thing and what Metaphil is doing, seeing that all these people are combined together and then separating the consciousness, and all these people and children just falling to the ground in a real heap, and Swamp Thing just being separated and having really nothing to combine to. It's a really horrifying bit of writing that, again, Alan Moore really knows how to write horror, and Rick Veitch knows how to write this horror as well. A really good combination of the two that gets at all the different types of space horror that can really be, and all the different types of science fiction there, which I really like, because a lot of people might consider Swamp Thing to be a hero, but as Alan Moore has shown throughout this series, it's more than just superhero stuff. It's sort of plant-based environmental horror or science fiction-based horror in this series. And then, the last thing worth noting is how, once Swamp Thing gets back on Earth, the process of him hunting down the government workers and either killing them in unique ways, or in some cases tearing their bodies apart and delivering justice or some semblance of vengeance for the actions they committed against him in the previous volume. It's very righteous, but also, dear God, I wouldn't want any of this to happen to me, because it's just so, mind-boggling, or like terrifying that this could be a thing that happens. Like, obviously it's not going to happen, but what if it does happen? It's a little scary. Another thing we're talking about in this volume, as well as the overarching series, is Swamp Thing's power and the relation to humanity there. He talks quite a bit about humanity, specifically noting the bad things that are going on, and noting how Swamp Thing is capable of godlike power, seemingly invincible unless people invent special weapons to prevent that from otherwise. Like when he goes back on Ran, or goes to Ran, like there's been a thermonuclear war that prevents any plants from growing. But Swamp Thing digs deep into the earth and manages to bring back the plant life, seemingly saving the planet and its people. A very godlike action that you don't see out of many superheroes. And Moore is also at the same time commentating on the state of the world and humanity, noting in volume, I think it's 2 or 3, the rise of nuclear power and how it's damaging the environment, and how there's a lot of destruction and chaos taking place because the people with power are abusing it. He talks a lot about Reagan in this series, specifically how Reagan was corrupt, how Reagan was involved in a lot of scandals, and how Reagan was not at all good for the environment. That's antithesis to Swamp Thing. You have Swamp Thing standing for the green, for keeping the earth as healthy as possible, and you have the governments doing really nothing to help the environment or making it actively worse. And so at that point, you have a question: is Swamp Thing obligated to help humanity? Because he has immense power and there's multiple incarnations of Swamp Thing, does Swamp Thing have an obligation to help humanity, to further it along, to fix the problems that arise and help humanity as they progress to a more environmentally friendly place, and maybe even in the case of human villains, just straight up killing them and as a way to send messages to the others? There's an interesting quote from this that I think addresses that problem. Is this then what it means to be a god? To know and never do, to watch the world wind by and in its windings find content? If I should feed the world, heal all the wounds man's smoldering industries have made, what would he do? Would he renounce the wealth his sawmills bring? Step gently on the flowers instead and pluck each apple with respect for this abundant world in all its providence? No. He would pump more poisons, build more mines, safe in the knowledge that I stood on hand to mend the biosphere, endlessly covering the scars he could now endlessly inflict. And that is a really good bit of writing by Alan Moore here, stating that although Swamp Thing could very easily help humanity, he knows that if he stood by and fixed things, humanity wouldn't grow as a result. Humanity might actively make things a little bit worse because they knew that if anything goes wrong, this swamp god over here can fix things. And that's a really fascinating sort of dilemma to have, which also addresses what the Parliament of Trees were talking about, because they told Swamp Thing to use his power wisely, that he might have a godly amount of power, but he shouldn't go using it all willy-nilly. And in that, the Parliament of Trees were talking about, being cautious with how you help humanity, because you can fix everything, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you should. In that way, it creates a bit of a Superman problem, where my problem with Superman is he has the power to do anything. He could solve all of humanity's problems. He could make it so nobody has to suffer, and yet he does not do that. Swamp Thing has the power to fix, the environment and make sure that those who attempt to mess with it and gain money from exploiting the environment suffer, and yet Swamp Thing chooses not to do that all the time. And it seems like a real misuse of power, and creates a number of problems with the idea of superheroes in general, and that they often don't seem to be fighting for the common good. They're fighting for military or to maintain a weird status quo that doesn't benefit everybody. But at the same time, I think, because Alan Moore was writing Watchmen at the same time, I think that he does address that problem there, and that Dr. Manhattan has the power to fix everything. He has the problem to solve the entire world's problems, but he's so powerful, he's so out of tune with humanity that he can't relate anymore to their problems. He's something else entirely, and he's not going to worry himself about the small problems of humanity when he could focus on much larger and grander things that are more befit of some type of god. And that's about the case of what's happening with Swamp Thing. Like, he might help humanity from time to time, but he's so powerful that anything that he does will interfere with the natural course of humanity, and it's much better to push them in the right direction and hope that they maintain the course than to completely outright solve the problem. So a lot worth thinking about, and that happens throughout the entire series, where Alan Moore is posing these kinds of questions about Swamp Thing, a character that already existed, and getting us to consider him in a new way. I really like that about this entire series, and it really really goes to show the power and the quality of writing that Alan Moore has delivered over time. Alan Moore also talks about Abby's grief. I do like how he talks frequently about Abby and Swamp Thing's relationship, what they mean to each other, and what their absence means. Like, without Abby, Swamp Thing goes mad because he doesn't have anything to tether him down, and without Swamp Thing, Abby is left with nothing but her grief. Because not only has she lost Swamp Thing many times, but she's lost those who are close to her. Matt Cable, who was possessed by Dr. Arcane and also dealt with his own addictions. You have her brother, Anton Arcane, or her uncle, Anton Arcane, who did super evil things. You had her father, Gregory Arcane, and who knows what happened to her mother. All tragic things occurred in her life. And so without Swamp Thing to be there, she has nothing but herself. Sure, she has friends, but she doesn't have that love that she wants, that she feels with Swamp Thing. And so like at the end of the series, you're able to see her grow and develop a sense of hope and resilience, where she notes that like she's kind of glad that Swamp Thing went away because it taught her that she can be alone and that she's capable of doing that. But she's also glad that he came back because she didn't have to live in that sadness anymore, that it didn't have to be persistent to her. There's a whole bunch of other things that are worth talking about in this series, including what the villains represent, not only on Earth, but also in space, and, you know, how this series built on previous volumes. I'm sure that's worth talking about, probably worth exploring, you know, the earlier volumes down the road. But there are a couple of bad things. One thing that I don't like is how through this, at least in this volume, there's a bunch of like dialogue that is untranslated because it's alien dialogue. So we don't really get what those people are seeing, and it happens enough that it's just kind of annoying, more so than anything else. And this volume does feel particularly unfocused at times. Like it's just Swamp Thing traveling to different planets, and I do like the standalone kind of horror feel to it, but it doesn't have that grand scope that previous volumes seem to have, of focusing on a single story with the ability for us to explore Swamp Thing's character a little bit more. This really felt like us looking at Swamp Thing from an alien's perspective, other people's perspective, and I didn't vibe with that as much as I might have otherwise. So it was somewhat of a weakness in an otherwise amazing volume here. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Swamp Thing Volume 6, a pretty high-quality installment and an otherwise amazing series, amazing run of graphic novels, of comic books by Alan Moore and Company. I do highly recommend this for you to check out. It's just what Alan Moore is writing about here. He's writing about power, of the use of power, of the environment, of corruption, of the supernatural, of horror, writing about a lot of interesting things, and it's surprising how consistently good it is throughout the series. But it's also not a surprise because, of course, it's Alan Moore. There's a reason why people regard him so highly. But I will say that this collection here was on par with Neil Gaiman's The Sandman series, exploring a lot of the same ideas and having similar main characters. And that Swamp Thing and the Sandman, you couldn't really harm them. You could hurt them a little bit, but they ultimately won. They were so powerful that they couldn't be destroyed unless by their own doing or something like that. So something very interesting to consider. And if you, I guess I would also mean, I recommend the Sandman series as well. If you haven't watched my videos on that, go do that as well. But yeah, if you read this before, you simply want to comment on something I've said throughout the series, do so below. Let's have a discussion about Swamp Thing. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this author or this series if they don't already know, and I have a feeling very few people don't already know. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and space horror travels. Farewell.